Hi. How's that? Is that booming enough? Okay.
Yeah, it surprised you, didn't it? Obviously, Reverend Mitra isn't here this morning. So I'm Mike Neugent, and I have the honor of, I shouldn't say filling in for her, but I guess filling in for her. So this morning's sermon is going to be, for me, a very difficult story to tell, because it's very personal. So it's a story that, for me, started out with a great deal of anger, divisiveness, bitterness. And unexpectedly turned into a story of forgiveness and reconciliation and hope. And talk about that. So, Rob, if you could please join us in the song for gathering. I believe the word 123. Please rise, body and spirit, sing. Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the words of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life a shape of justice. Roots pull me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
We light this chalice to celebrate Unitarian Universalism. This is the church of the open mind. This is the church of the helping hands. This is the church of the loving heart. Together, we care for the church and each other. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to St. John's Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is Rita Volz. I am your worship associate today. Our worship leader is Mike Neugent, as he said earlier, and Reverend Mitra is out today. We are a community of brave, curious, compassionate thinkers and doers. We are diverse in faith, ethnicity, history, spirituality, but aligned in our desire to make a difference for the good. We have a track record of standing on the side of love, justice, and peace. We're so happy you have chosen to worship with us today. Please join me in our affirmation. This is the mission of our faith, to teach the fragile art of hospitality, to revere both the critical mind and the generous heart, to prove that diversity need not mean divisiveness, and to witness to all that we must hold the whole world in our hands. Okay, getting us started today, we have a membership moment. John Kashuba, please join us.
Thank you. It's been probably, I'll bet about 8 years since I've actually been up here at the podium to say anything, so it's kind of nice to be here. To talk about membership, I think it's important for you to understand sort of where I came from and how I got to this path, how I became a member. The first thing is, like I know many of you out there who I've spoken to over the years, I was raised in a very traditional, very strict Roman Catholic family. Michael's probably nodding his head already. I'm not even looking at him. I'm sure he's probably nodding his head. So, I have a brother, Mike, who is 3 years my junior. The two of us did all the traditional Catholic things, which was, going to church every Sunday, dressed tie and jacket, observing all the holidays, making sure you went to your first communion, to your confirmation, all that kind of stuff. So we did all that. And I accepted everything at face value. Being a kid, this is what my parents believed, that's what I believed. What did I know, right? As I grew older, I became an altar boy. My brother and I went to Catholic high schools, Catholic universities. At one point, when I was older, I was what they were calling an extraordinary minister. I'm not sure if they still use that term. And boy, I'm getting a feedback in my ear here. I'm not sure why it is, but anyway, which is basically a lay person who distributes communion during Mass. So I was doing that. I was also on the parish council of the last Catholic church that I belonged to. So I was very active. But all the time that I was that active, I still had questions about theology, about things that just didn't make sense to me in Catholicism that I had just taken for granted. So when my first wife and I divorced in the early 1980s, I didn't have to worry about questioning anything more because the church basically said, "You're out. Don't sweat it, man. We don't want you anymore." You become persona non grata. You're excommunicated, which means as a Catholic you cannot receive communion. If you cannot receive communion, there's really no point in being a Catholic. That's pretty much the essence of Catholicism, is that communion with God in communion. So when that happened, I was not surprised. I kind of knew that was going to happen. But what it did for me, though, is it opened my eyes up to other people, other groups that I thought are marginalized. I kind of considered myself being marginalized, being shunted out of the church. So I started thinking about, for instance, the role of women in the Catholic Church. And I said, there's no priests, no women in the priesthood. To me, it seemed like women were second-class citizens, and I couldn't understand why that was. I couldn't understand how, when I looked around in the two Catholic churches that I grew up in, I never saw a person of color. And I lived in neighborhoods that were primarily white, but not entirely. And yet there was nobody of color. Nor was there ever even sort of mention of why there weren't any people of color in our congregation. I also started wondering why the church told me that I should not consider anybody who identified other than cisgender as being worth having an inherent dignity and worth as we believe in the first principle. So all these things made me think like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, maybe at the right time, I'm not sure. And that when the church and I parted ways, nobody cried about the breakup. Neither one of us. We were both happy with that situation. So in 1991, Mary and I got married. And at that point, neither one of us were observant in the sense of going to any religious functions in any particular church. We both felt spiritual in that we continued to read widely in different spiritual texts from different cultures. And then in 2000, was it 2000? Yeah, in 2000, we went to Athens, Ohio, where for 8 years, the two of us were teaching at Ohio University. And in Athens, we came across a little dinky sign on a lawn somewhere that said Athens UU Fellowship, with a little arrow about that big, going down this winding, one-lane road up in the cow pasture someplace. And Mary, in some of her reading, had come across a book about retreat centers and conference centers, spiritual centers. And one of the places mentioned was the Rose Center in Massachusetts. And if you don't know about that, it's affiliated with the UUA. And it's a long-standing sort of spiritual conference center. And she had read that, and she was very impressed by it. So when she saw that sign, she said, "Oh, that sounds good." Now, I knew something about Unitarians, having grown up in New England. I used to see a fair number of Unitarian churches, which were formerly old Congregationalist churches that had changed over the years. So I saw them, but of course I didn't know anything about Unitarianism or Universalism because I was raised Catholic. And you don't bother looking at other religions that are in error. So I knew nothing about UUs. But we attended the fellowship, about 60 people, very beautiful, small little church. And we were immediately sort of grabbed by a woman there named Heather Johnson, who was the Athens Fellowship's equivalent of Barbara Hatton. Okay. And she took us under her wing, and introduced us to people and everything else. And we were really hooked with the nature of what we were hearing in the lectures, what we were hearing what we were seeing in their activities. And it was primarily a lay-led congregation. There was a minister there that was quarter-time minister. So we'd see him like once a month for a service. And we were so impressed by that when we came back to Cincinnati in 2008, we started immediately looking for a UU church. And living in North Avondale, we were halfway pretty much between St. John's and First Church. So we started going back and forth, First Church one Sunday, St. John's another Sunday, First Church, to see which one we really liked. And so show of hands, how many of you have had the Haddon experience? More, I'm sure, of walking into the church and meeting Barbara Haddon. Yeah, okay. So Barbara was actually a big factor in us deciding to make St. John's our spiritual home. And it was not just Barbara, it was the whole congregation that we found to be very welcoming. We found them to have the same belief system, the same worldview that we endorsed. And more than that, we thought of it as a community, and not just a spiritual community in this building, but outside in the community, because we found out that so many people that come to St. John's actually live in the nearby community. So a lot of our friends now, outside of church, are actually church friends outside of church. So it's sort of like two communities that we developed, and we were looking for that. The other thing that appealed to us big time was the emphasis on social justice that we saw here. Now, it sounds like I've been bad-mouthing the Catholic Church. Okay, so I have been. But, I have to also realize that they do good things. They do good work. They do good charity. They do good social service. Right here, Cincinnati Catholic Services is big for immigration here and everything else. So I have to respect that. But what I noticed in my churches growing up was that social justice was something that was spoken of from the pulpit, and normally by a missionary from Africa, who would talk about the poor little African kids who were starving, and we'd pass a basket and we'd put money in there for them. And that was great. But that was all I ever saw. I never saw anybody getting up off their, chairs and doing something with their hands. I'm sure there were people doing it, but I never saw that. I see it here all the time. So what appealed to us more than anything was that in St. John's, we saw people doing social justice, not just through their wallets, but through their hands, through their heart. And that really appealed to us. It gave us a chance to actually do something here. So we became involved. We actually became members. We signed the book. We became official. And that was in 2008. So we've been here, some time. Both of us have served. Mary and I have both served on the board. I've served in social justice committees, outreach committees, partner church, sanctuary and immigration. I did some work with some of the ad hoc committees that we had, the one that drew up our racial resolution, the one that did the bylaws revision. So I've been very involved in a lot of what's going on here. And I'm saying that not to say, hey, look at me, look what I've done, but what I'm trying to do here is show you that there are so many different ways that your skills, your talents could be useful to St. John's. There's activities, there's standing committees, but there's so much going on behind that. I know a lot of people here are doing social justice work that has nothing to do with any particular committee in St. John's or any team, if you will. They're doing it on their own. So you're all involved, and those skills can come to St. John's as well. So for Mary and I, basically, we believe that if the St. John's community supports and nourishes what we value in our lives, then we should reciprocate financially and with our hearts and hands. So I'm asking you, if you are already a member, I'm asking you to consider what you're doing at St. John's, how you can do more at St. John's. If you're not a member yet, if you're new to the church, I'd like you to consider what skills and talents you have and how you can also help too. The thing is, St. John's needs your heart, your hands, your finances, probably most of all your heart. And I think that's for the betterment of all. So, thank you.
to sing, you can come sing in the choir too. It's a wonderful thing to add your heart to this, among all the many other things that we do. We're going to sing, a little out of order in the program, we're going to sing Break Not the Circle, hymn 323. And I encourage you to listen to the words because it was chosen specifically to be relevant to the message that Mike is going to share with us later. Okay, so please rise and we'll sing hymn 323.
So, as our tradition here, if you could join us for joys and sorrows. As always, we place a stone that could represent our joy or our sorrow, those both spoken and unspoken. If you would like something to be mentioned specifically, let us know. Also, if you're online, put it in chat, and we'll mention it at the end. And I'll also place a stone for those unspoken. And we'll see if we can get this to light. It tends to be a little temperamental. As Reverend Mitra mentioned a couple weeks ago, you just got to let it sit for a while. So, a joy for Emily Hodges' rapid healing for all those with COVID. And for Ma'am Newman? Mary Newman, coming home from rehab? Yes. Sorry? She was home yesterday. I've been in rehab off and on for the last 4 months, so I know how it feels. So I was born and raised in Cincinnati. My mother was born in Columbus. My father was born in Cincinnati. My mom was, at that era, one of those children that was a child of a divorced family, which back in the 40s was a really big deal, and raised by her mother. So her parental model was her mother. My dad, on the other hand, his parents, my grandparents, were both raised in Birmingham, Alabama. Completely different culture, especially in that era, than being raised here. So my dad was raised in a family that had a very, very strong father figure. When I would visit my grandparents, it was really obvious who ran the house. There was no doubt in anybody's mind. And my grandfather was one that had this model that as a father, it was to provide for the family and rule the family. And so as a child, I'm one of 4 siblings. I'm the oldest. And for the first 3 or 4 years of my life, my remembrance is having a very close relationship with my father. As I started to get a little bit older, I grew up with one favorite word: why? And sometimes that would drive him nuts. So my parents, especially my dad, their style of parenting in some ways today would be considered very inappropriate. My father's, especially my father's way of discipline was physical and emotional, and literally today would be considered not the right thing to do. And it's hard to talk about it sometimes. And so what happened over time, my relationship with my father, and not just mine, but all 4 siblings, became very separated, very distant. So, and it impacted, to this day, my own personality. Late 70s, my parents decided to move to Florida. Within literally 4 to 5 years of moving down there, they were divorced. My mother eventually moved, and shortly after that, to St. Petersburg. They lived in Naples and remarried. As a sign of how broken that relationship was with my father, when my parents divorced, from literally early 80s, going forward 20 years, I believe that 2 of us went down one, or my siblings and I went down twice to see my father in 20-some years. There was really no relationship between us and him. But ironically, there was a very different relationship, however, between my siblings and my mother. Ironically, as we've talked about before, I entered seminary in 2001. About 2003, 2004, I noticed a shift. Not a big one, a really tiny one. A very tiny one, actually. Where my father all of a sudden started to, in a very small way, try to re-engage. It wasn't a lot. It wasn't like there was this magical epiphany where we went from having, in essence, no relationship to a close relationship. But it started to change, or at least I thought so. In 2005, beginning of February, I get a call from my father. He says, I'm having colon surgery tomorrow because they found I have colon cancer. They found a tumor in his colon. And surprisingly, my response was, I'll come down. He said, oh, don't worry about it. I'm going to be there for a day. I'll go home the next day. It's no big deal. Well, part of the story was in the mid-'70s, my father had had massive heart attacks, strokes, et cetera. So his cardiopulmonary system was massively compromised. And back then, ironically, he had either a triple or quadruple bypass in the mid-'70s. And back then, they lasted for maybe 20 years. And his still lasted was still good in 2005. During the surgery, he aspirated. So he became ventilator dependent. When they tried to take him off the ventilator, he went into cardiac arrest. So they had to keep him ventilator dependent, which means to do that, you had to keep the person sedated, because if not, they'll try to take the ventilator out. So my two brothers and I went down, and my sister came down a day later to see him. And it was tough because, he was really not sure you were there. There was really no way to have a conversation with him. And we left because we couldn't stay. So about 6 weeks later, Medicare said, you can't stay here anymore because I think you can stay in the hospital for 6 weeks, and then they say, your days are up. So they moved him to St. Petersburg to a rehab or a nursing home, basically, that specialized in ventilator-dependent patients. Well, part of the story was my father at that point had a girlfriend that he was living with. They shared a house. And God bless her, twice a week she would take a bus from Naples, Florida to St. Petersburg to see my dad. What did she see that I didn't see? Because that was shocking to me. So, and to this day, I don't know why. But during Easter break, I decided to go down to St. Petersburg to see my dad. I don't know what propelled me to do that, but something did. So I sat in the nursing home with my dad. He had a tracheotomy at that point, so he couldn't talk, but he wasn't ventilator dependent, so he was awake and responsive. And I remember sitting there, he was watching an old Western, and I'm like, all right, I'm bored. And then I thought, I can leave, but he can't. So before I left, because I was in seminary, I was lucky I could stay in a local parish. And the parish was, I don't remember which one, but was run by a religious order. And John, I was not actually raised Catholic, but they were kind enough, and my family's not Catholic. My dad's not Catholic. So the order, one of the priests was kind enough to say, do you want me to come to the nursing home and bless your father? I said, well, let me ask him. It's not my decision to make, but I'll ask. So I asked my dad, and I think he panicked because it's like, do what? But what came out of that was somehow a conversation that was mouthed and not spoken, that he wanted to know who this priest was. And I told him that they were part of a religious order. They were not diocesan, so their lives were very different. And part of that difference was they could have no personal possessions. And he looked at me and he pointed at me and said, you? Not said it, mouthed it. And I said, no, because I was studying for a diocese, and I didn't have those limitations. I don't know if it happened then or if it happened in the course of a few days after that, but I started to see things in a slightly different way. What I also remember is the only recollection I ever have of my father telling me he loved me was he mouthed those words laying in that bed. Luckily, I was given a gift that I was given the opportunity to take a step back and see my father's role as a parent through his eyes and not mine. I remembered being a kid, and if any of you have ever done geometry in high school, he was teaching me geometry in the backyard. We actually had a privacy fence, and he said, well, if you take this side of the fence and that side of the fence and you run a string between them, you can tell the distance by doing. His role was to teach. His role was to provide for. That's not what I thought I needed as a child. But that's how he loved being a parent. And so, because of that, and I never ever went down for that reason, because of that, I was able to see my father's role through his eyes. Don't make no mistake. I didn't agree with him. I still don't. But I could see it through his eyes. And so because of that, I was able to forgive him and me. I was able to forgive him because of the way I felt he had treated me. And I was able to forgive myself for those times when I probably should have reached out more. And because of that, I was able to reconcile to some degree with my father, who passed away literally 2 or 3 weeks after that. It became for me a journey of hope. And I will carry that story with me to the day I die. So how does that matter today? I have to remind myself sometimes that there's always the opportunities for us to become divided, to become angry, and probably some other emotions that are even more difficult. I may never agree with what happened, but by taking a moment to take a step back and try to see it through the other person's eyes, I may find a way to forgive, and I may find a way to reconcile. So my hope for all of us is that when we're faced with that, we may never agree with what the other person did. But maybe in that moment that we can take a step back and we can ask ourselves, what is that person seeing? What is that person feeling? Why is that person doing what they're doing? And we can at least hopefully find a way to forgive and let that forgiveness bring that relationship to reconciliation. Because I got to tell you, my 3 siblings, their relationship with my father is completely different than mine. My one brother, to this day, when he talks about my dad, the embedded anger is still there. Mine's not. And it's not because of what I did, but it was because I was given this unexpected, profound sense of hope and this gift to be able to find and be asked to find forgiveness and reconciliation.
So,
think there's a lag in this when it comes on. So if we could at this point, help support the mission of St. John's as we go forward, and give as we are able to give.
We have a reading today along the lines of forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness has been called the path back to the true self. It is essential to the healing of old wounds and letting go of old wrongs. In forgiving others, we do not deny or condone the wrongdoing. Instead, we stop the flow of pain, reclaim hope, and commit ourselves to beginning anew. When we forgive, we come as close as any human being can to the essentially divine act of creation. This path need not be limited to individual people, however. Communities can reap the same benefits with communal forgiveness, introspection, and transformation. Imagine how much stronger a community could become by practicing forgiveness as a group. Bishop Desmond Tutu has said, "Forgiving and being reconciled to our enemies or our loved ones are not about pretending that things are other than they are. It is not about patting one another on the back and turning a blind eye to the wrong. True reconciliation exposes the awfulness, the abuse, the hurt, the truth. It could even sometimes make things worse. It is a risky undertaking, but in the end, it is worthwhile. Because in the end, only honest confrontation with reality can bring real healing. Superficial reconciliation can only bring superficial healing." I end this reading today with a poem from Rudy Francisco. "Gather your mistakes, rinse them with honesty and reflection. Let them dry until you can see every choice and the regret becomes brittle. Cover the entire surface in forgiveness. Remind yourself that you are human, and this too is a gift.
Thank you, Rita. So, ironically, we didn't coordinate the readings in the sermon. It's amazing how one seems to very much illuminate the other. So I just want to bring your attention to the announcements that are in the bulletin, or the order of service. I guess that's the Catholic part of me, John. It's still a bulletin. Ironically, some of the today's service has kind of been out of order, so it kind of goes back to the conversation we had a couple weeks ago. It's like a Jesuit service. Nobody got hurt, so it's valid. So I would like to invite Debbie up to give a brief announcement.
Good morning. My announcement is in my role as historian at St. John's, my most favorite volunteer position. So after service, I'll be sitting in Hanley Hall, which is the lobby area, and I have the guest book from last Sunday when we were at the transept. And so if anyone was here last Sunday but didn't get a chance to sign the guest book, please do. There's also an order of service, a stack of those if you want one of those, and then there's a little one-page historical document that gives words of the 3 ministers who served there. And the one that's especially interesting is what Reverend Eisenlohr had to say, who was there the longest. And speaking of Reverend Eisenlohr, his great-grandson is having an art show here, and this Friday evening, he is having a special opening just for St. John's. He's serving some finger food and wine, so I hope you can come and meet Reverend Eisenlohr's great-grandson, and maybe buy some of his art. The church benefits from that. You'd make Roger very happy because he's 83 years old, and his goal is not to make money, but to get the art out of his house so that he doesn't have to have his son do that later on. Anyway, please stop by. Thanks.
Thank you. There's one announcement we wanted to draw a little special attention to from two perspectives, and that is next Sunday. So next Sunday will be Reverend Mitra's last service here until she goes on sabbatical. So she will be gone for 4 months. The other part is that Sean Gaskell will be doing a special musical performance, and that will also be woven into next week's service. So before we sing hymn 179, again, these were not coordinated, but when Rob showed me the words, some of the words, I thought they touched me based upon what my experience was. And so part of the first line is, words that we hold tight won't let us go. Paths that we don't follow will haunt us so. Which I think, from my experience, was so unbelievably true.
So because this one's a little unfamiliar, I'm going to say a word or two. Pung Chang is going to play through, it's just a melody. There aren't parts. If everybody opens to 179, you'll see that there's just a single note melody that he's going to play through so that you all can hear it. And then on Thursday night, when we went through this with the choir, you'll see that the bottom part says drum, right? And I was like trying to clap my hands, trying to sing the notes on the top and clap my hands to the bottom, and Pung Cheng goes, I can just play the right hand and I'll play the drum with my left hand. how about we do that? And I went, cool, right? So Pung Chang is going to play the melody for us once where I'll just listen, and then there'll be the little bit of introduction, and then we'll all sing together while Pung Chang accompanies us on both the drum and the piano. So, yeah. Please rise. So Spirit, how to befriend, show us how to forgive, to all who live, show us forgiveness, that we may live. To speak of loving is not to love. Rise, move among us, below, above. When we are raging, needing to mend, show us, O Spirit, how to befriend. Show us how to forgive, to all who live. Show us forgiveness, that we may live. When love is doubtful, choice is not clear, we turn to worship, to cast out fear. Teach us forgiveness, make love our end. Show us, O Spirit, how to befriend. Show us how to forgive, to all who live. Show us forgiveness, that we may live. Thank you, and thank you, Pung Chang.
So as we end today's service, let us be mindful of the holiday that we celebrate tomorrow, Labor Day. So as we leave this place, let us take a moment to be thankful for those who toil on our behalf, who are the unspoken heroes in many cases that in many ways we don't even recognize or see, but the sacrifices they make so that we can live the lives that we live. May we go in peace and in love.
pressure weeks. We got some challenging pieces, some that might not work out because they're too challenging. We're going to try them anyway, at least try to get there. And the more voices we need, the more voices, like I'm hoping Tom can come back. I'm hoping Nathan can come back.
For sure. I mean, they're just away, I'm sure.
The last I heard it was they were waiting for the kids to get vaccinated, which they should be able to get vaccinated now unless they're still waiting for like the full series, which could be. I'm hoping Nathan, I'm hoping, I mean, trying to think who else. Some tenors, some of the tenors. Rich, Overturf, I'm hoping maybe. A couple of altos. So anyway, just I need more voices so when people aren't there, we can still make it go.
Certain mass, it's
That's right. That's right. Yeah.